So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for NCFP's Community Foundations Network program, helping donor families support efforts to strengthen democracy and increase civic engagement. We're really excited that you're here today, and we're excited about having a conversation about this really important topic. As we all know, the hyperpolarization of public discourse is evident all around us today. But at the same time, there are movements across the country that are working to bridge divides, to shore up and strengthen justice and equity. And many giving families are looking for ways to support these democracy strengthening efforts and to increase civic engagement. So today we're going to be having a conversation with several colleagues who I'm really excited to introduce you to in just a minute, who are going to share stories and learnings about what's working well, what's challenging, and how best to talk with philanthropic families about supporting these efforts. I'm Dara Tatanko. I'm Director of Programs at the National Center for Family Philanthropy, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's program. I know that many of you know NCFP, and some of you know us very well, but I know there's always new people coming to the network, so I just briefly want to mention who we are. As you may know, NCFP was founded in 1997. We're the leading source of knowledge and expertise in community for family philanthropy. We're a network of more than 400 philanthropic families and those who work with them, who are committed to a world that's vibrant, equitable, and resilient. And our donors and the advisors and those who work with them come to NCFP to learn, to explore new practices, and to grapple with fundamental questions facing our sector. And this Community Foundations Family Philanthropy Network exists to enhance the effectiveness of Community Foundation staff in their work with family donors. And our goal is to help you more effectively serve your donors. The network's comprised of more than 50 community foundations across the country, and we meet throughout the year to create shared tools, exchange insights, build capacity for the field, and create new connections. So now back to the program. We really want the program to be interactive. We're a small group today, so we really want you to feel comfortable to ask questions at any time. If you have some burning questions now, feel free to put them in the chat, but during the conversation we're having today, please feel free to raise your hand, whether it's your actual hand or the Zoom hand, if you have a question, because we really want this to be interactive. So now I just want to introduce our speakers, and I will stop talking in just a minute and hand it over to them. But first, I want to introduce you all to Kelly Nolan. Kelly's a fifth-generation Andrus family member who's been actively engaged in her family's philanthropy for over 20 years. She served for 12 years on the board of the Certain Foundation, a family-led social justice foundation that was started by her great-great-grandfather. Kelly's been actively involved with NCFP. She's an amazing partner of NCFP, serving on the board and as board chair, and she was an NCFP fellow from 2018 to 2021. And she also recently served as a speaker on one of our webinars, so we just love working with Kelly and really appreciate her partnership. And currently, she's the principal of KDN Philanthropy Consulting, which develops strategies for family foundations and nonprofits. And our other speakers are both from the Rose Community Foundation. So we have Ray Barry-Kivel, who is the Policy and Advocacy Manager there. In his role, Ray advances the foundation's advocacy objectives and related grant-making portfolio aimed at improving the regional policy landscape on behalf of the foundation's mission, vision, and strategic priorities. And Ray has prior experience working on state and local political campaigns in Colorado. Also, our other speaker is Judy Altenberg, who's Director of Donor Funds and Legacy Giving at the Rose Community Foundation. In her role, Judy stewards and supports foundation fund holders, legacy donors, and financial advisors. She's been involved with the foundation since 2007 as a foundation trustee and a member of the Education Committee and chair of the Jewish Life Committee. And Judy's also a current member of NCFP's Community Foundations Network Advisory Committee. So also really appreciate her service to all of us in that role. So now I am going to stop talking. I really am so pleased that the three of you are here to guide the conversation on this important topic. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Judy to get us started. So Judy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Daria. It's so nice to see all of you. Thank you for being here and being part of our conversation. And we really do want to make this interactive. So please feel free to pop in if you have an idea, if you have questions. We also want to hear from you. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on Rose Community Foundation, in part because for us, it really level sets why we're able to do the work that we're able to do in this world, in this policy and advocacy space. Rose Community Foundation was Rose Hospital was founded and funded in post-World War II by the Jewish community so that Jewish doctors and doctors of color could have a place to practice medicine. There was heightened anti-Semitism and obviously a lot of racism, and so folks needed a place to be able to practice, and folks needed a place to be able to have healthcare opportunities for everyone. Those roots formed Rose Community Foundation. When the hospital was sold in 1995, the proceeds from the sale of the hospital went to form Rose Community Foundation. So we're a hospital conversion foundation. And those roots in the Jewish community really have kind of shaped who we are. And it gives us the incredible privilege of it having an endowment. So our corpus is really 2/3 of our corpus is from the endowment of the sale of the hospital. So 2/3 of our dollars are in that endowment that goes out into our grant making, and Ray can talk more about because it is around our policy and advocacy and other grant making that we do. And then 1/3 of our dollars are in donor advised funds and nonprofit funds that we steward on behalf of others. And so we have many fewer donor advised funds than some of the other kind of traditional community foundations. So we have 161 donor advised funds, which allows us and our team to really know our donors quite well. And we have the privilege of really understanding kind of what our donors care about, and we have the dollars to be able to leverage from our community grant making side. So I just wanted to kind of give you that background because it helps us have a platform for the work that we do. We don't typically have donors walk away because we're doing policy and advocacy work. Our strategic plan in 2020 really took our philanthropic services level to kind of the next level. And part of that, a really intentional part of it, was around deploying resources into the community and specifically calling out policy and advocacy work. We kind of really needed to use our outside voice. Prior to 2020, we were quiet. We did some very small, grant making in maybe school bond initiatives or things like that, but it wasn't like what we do now. And our donors weren't really tasked or asked to kind of be involved in the same way. But this kind of strategic plan also allowed us to put a stake in the ground and as to where we stood on issues that we were seeing in our community around, really with kind of the overarching view around equity, justice, and inclusion. So we work with donors a lot in this regard and in our broader policy and advocacy work. And I'm going to turn it over to Ray to really talk about how we at the foundation kind of approach this work and think about it.
Thanks, Judy. And hi, everybody. Sorry for my connection issues. Hopefully I'll be back online in a sec. But at Rose, we fund a few different approaches to civic engagement work, voter participation work, community organizing and engagement, and civic leadership development. But each of these funding strategies are really united by a simple objective, which is supporting efforts that elevate the voices and the priorities of folks who are furthest from opportunity. So if you're a donor and you care about giving people who have historically been left out of our civic processes the tools and the platform to engage civically, then you care about civic engagement, and you probably would be interested in funding civic engagement work in some capacity. And from there, as Judy can speak to, as Kelly can speak to, there are so many different and exciting organizations and projects you can plug into. At Rose, I oversee about 1/4 of the foundation's discretionary grant making, and I have the privilege of funding some amazing civic engagement, policy, and advocacy efforts here in Colorado. And we're not going to talk about the advocacy work much today, but the funding of policy and advocacy work and our own lobbying and engagement around ballot initiatives. But I mention it because I see systems change work as being across a pretty wide continuum. And if policy campaigns are on one end, then civic engagement is really the critical ingredient at the other end of the spectrum that is so essential to whatever issue you care about, whatever population you work with. It's really, I think of it as the base that builds a foundation on top of which a community and its people can thrive. And the nice thing about civic engagement, especially in this context when talking about it with donors, and Judy can speak more to this directly, but it's a little bit less scary and controversial than some of the advocacy work can sometimes feel. I know sometimes in conversations with our donors around policy work, we hear a lot of, I don't really want to get into politics. I don't feel fully comfortable with that. That feels a little messy. It doesn't feel like where I want to show up. And I get all that. It's a little bit scary at first. So civic engagement feels a little bit more comfortable, but compared to, a direct contribution to your kid's school or giving to a food bank, it's still a little bit sexier. There are some innovative approaches on the ground that donors can really get excited about once they get over that initial fear. So a few quick takeaways, any of which I'm happy to dive deeper into when we open things up for conversation and questions. And seeing the list of community foundations on this call, my guess is you all are doing this work along with us and would love to learn from you. The number one thing I want to emphasize, and I'm workshopping this, but I call it my Cheesecake Factory menu principle. So some donors will be more excited about specific grassroots voter engagement or community organizing efforts that are connected to the issues or populations they care most about. And that's great. Others might be more interested in funding more pillar-like infrastructure sustaining civic engagement organizations. Think of like your local League of Women Voters or Common Cause, whatever that institution is in your community. That's also great. Both of those types of work, so many other types of work, are critical to the civic engagement ecosystem, and we should celebrate all of them. So if you take nothing else away from my remarks, please remember that there is, bringing it back, a Cheesecake Factory-sized menu of options around civic engagement. And the folks on this call, we probably like most of the options on that menu. Donors might not like every option on that menu, but there will probably be something, especially with folks like you working with them, that resonates with them and that they would be interested in supporting and would feel comfortable supporting. The second thing I want to emphasize is so much of what we think of as civic engagement in the status quo, and I am most certainly guilty of this as well, is really engagement of already civically minded people. And I want us, we're really striving here at Rose. I hope that folks across the country are really striving to think of civic engagement in a broader context of that, and really thinking about inviting folks that historically haven't seen themselves in a lot of civic processes, whether it's the voting process, whether it's showing up to your local city council meeting, whether it's even just posting about issues that matter to you on social media. A lot of the structures in place that are easiest to support from a giving perspective don't really have those folks in mind. And so I want to just give a few quick examples. The first being community forums, which is really, that's what I think of when I think of civic engagement. That's the civic sphere, folks coming together to discuss issues, debate topics, oftentimes with policymakers. Those forums tend to bring out the most already engaged community members. So as a result, those people's top priorities are elevated in those spaces, which is great. But let's think about how can we get some new voices in the room and create processes where folks that haven't showed up there before not only feel welcome, but equipped to speak on behalf of themselves and their communities. And then I think the biggest example is elections. If you asked anyone, myself included, what's the biggest civic event of this year? It's obviously the 2024 presidential election. But when we think about, especially candidate campaigns, but candidate issue campaigns, any campaign that has an incentive to win, their incentive is to strategically target their messaging to the folks who are most likely to vote. So as a result, historically, lower propensity voters who, for a whole host of systemic issues that we can get into later if we want, skew less white, less wealthy, and younger, they're less likely to receive that outreach. They're less likely to see themselves as voters, which really reinforces that cycle. So I would implore you all to encourage donors to think beyond the places that we all might more traditionally associate with civic life, whether it's a high-profile Senate or presidential campaign, whether it's community institutions that are historically pretty well resourced, like a Chamber of Commerce or a Rotary Club, and support on-the-ground community groups, in addition to those other great groups that have spent decades building trusted relationships in their communities and who can have a huge impact getting folks engaged with just a little bit of funding. Your $5,000 contribution to the community organization, doing organizing work or voter engagement work in your neighborhood is going to have way bigger bang for your buck than giving that to one of the presidential campaigns. And then the last thing I would emphasize is, and if you talk to any nonprofit, this is one of the first things that they'll say. I think it's especially true when it comes to civic engagement work. As donors get more and more comfortable supporting civic engagement or advocacy projects that they're most excited about, encourage them to give general operating support to those organizations. I promise their dollars will still be supporting the work they care about. It'll make those dollars go even further because it gives the nonprofits greater flexibility, gives them the ability to execute on their mission more effectively. And that's true for I think that's true for any type of grant, from a foundation, from an individual, but especially in the civic engagement and policy and advocacy space where the wins might be a little less obvious. It's really about strengthening the fabric of a region and strengthening our democracy, for lack of a better word. You're not going to see, oh, we fed 100 people with this contribution. Those more specific direct service programmatic type results. And it's on us, I think, as funders who maybe are a little bit more comfortable placing the trust in nonprofit to educate donors as to why it's so important and why the things they care about will get to succeed even more with a general operating or multi-year grant. So I'll pause there, turn it back over to Judy, I think, for a few closing remarks about how you have worked with our donors as we've gone on this journey together, and excited for the broader conversation as well.
Thanks so much, Ray. That was such a great kind of overview and really, I think, raises some really important points for all of us to consider. And I think, something Ray and I talked about earlier was any donor who really cares about this, to the Cheesecake Factory menu option, there is an organization for you. Just think about that menu. It is ginormous. And so I think that there really are organizations that fit within this ecosystem. I think that for us, when we work with donors, this wouldn't be a surprise for community foundations when we talk so much about values-aligned philanthropy. And so we talk to our donors a lot about what are their values, what do they care about, and how does it align with how we're showing up at the foundation, and where are the places that we might be able to kind of come together in our values to be able to further fund. We focus a lot on equity, justice, and inclusion, and community. And I think that comes out in our civic engagement work. And I think that many of our donors really respond to that. So when we work with our donors, I kind of think of it in two ways. So we have an educational component, and then we have the real relational one-on-one work that many of us do. And from an educational point, we've done some things this year that I think have been really, interesting to really introduce the topic of advocacy and civic engagement to our donors. So last fall, we did a session on policy and advocacy work and how our donors could fit in, really giving them an overall framing of how to move the needle through systemic change and how they could support grassroots organizations, a lot of the ones that Ray talked about, doing this policy work. And our fundholders were actually given a preview of the slate of proposed policy and advocacy grantee partners and given the opportunity to help either close a gap with some of these smaller organizations, the kind of the non-institutional, new to us organizations, or they could fund alongside the foundation. We have a policy and advocacy fund. And so it was also part of the discussion was, leveraging those dollars in a policy and advocacy fund, leveraging their donor advised fund dollars, which it enabled us as a community foundation to be able to give out more in that grant making cycle. And we spent a lot of time talking about the distinction between what donors can do with their DAFs and what they would need to use their personal funds for, the C3 versus the C4 question. And to Ray's earlier point, like they can give to the C3 and it can be for education and it can be for general operating dollars, which frees some money up for the C4s to be able to do more of their policy work. We had on the spectrum of where Ray was talking about, we had the policy and advocacy work, then we had some legislative work. We did do a legislative session or a session about a legislative initiative, actually a statutory initiative. We have on the ballot this year in Colorado, an initiative to codify reproductive rights in the state constitution. We have a lot of funders who are very interested and very engaged in this issue. And so in conjunction with our other philanthropic partners in the community who are really leading the efforts around this ballot initiative, we invited our donors to really kind of the pre-kickoff to the initiative, really learn from our partners about what this means and what it meant to, get 2.5 million signatures and the costs involved and all of that kind of thing. It was a great session, really engaged donors. And kind of an unintended result was that some of our fund holders started making other donations to our partner organizations. And, it was never kind of the overall goal. The goal was really more educational, but I think that the happy result was that people felt more engaged and felt like financially they wanted to make some contributions there. Recently, we had a session on civic engagement and strengthening democracy. Again, remember this kind of the other side of the spectrum. We had 3 different perspectives to raise point about really focusing on these organizations that are serving communities that are kind of furthest from opportunity and not always getting the kind of the high propensity voters. So we had somebody from the Latina Initiative to talk about encouraging Latina women to vote and very specific demographic between the ages of 18 and 35 based on a lot of research they had been doing. We had someone from Transformative Leadership for Change, which are a group of BIPOC women who are leaders in their community, in their organizations, to give them space with each other to be able to better do the work of civic engagement, which is pretty hard work. To be on the ground and to feel like they had a group of people around them. So even donations to that is civic engagement. We had somebody from Youth Roots, and so how to engage youth in policy. Again, think about that group that's probably not going to be targeted. They're not yet voters, but you're starting to build these things. You're starting to also get these kids in front of a microphone to talk about, think about the community forums where it's the people who are kind of who are going to show up. These are not the people who are always going to show up to these community forums, but now you're training them at an early age to talk about issues that really they face in their communities and face as teens growing up in pretty hard times. And that overall goal of the session was really about educating donors and potential donors. We have also kind of focused on bringing in, using this a little bit as business development, and how to think about this type of philanthropy and thinking broadly about kind of such initiatives. And I think one of the important points that came out of this session, and I think Ray really alluded to this, but was that funders really should try to focus on this work, the strengthening democracy work, more than just in the presidential election year. And this is the long game. We really have to be thinking about this, doing this, priming people for this work, that this is not just about 2024. This is ongoing. And I think that, for us, we've experimented with a lot of things. These were very different approaches. The first around the ability to fund, here donors, here's how you can show up. The second, really just the informational ballot session, and the civic engagement panel, just the different approaches. And also in this most recent session, the attendees were given a 1-pager to take away, which highlighted the grantee partners that we've funded in this space. And so that they had a takeaway, that they had something they could look at, they could learn more, they can ask us. I will caution you, as a philanthropic services staff and community, and communication staff, it's a lot of work to pull all of that together, even in a smaller foundation. I mean, we're not so small, but in a foundation. And the second part of this is that one-on-one work. So now you have this 1-page takeaway, and now it's on us as donor advice fund, philanthropic advisors, to really work with our donors, to have those relational conversations, to have that understanding of, your values and where do you care about showing up, and how do you want to think about this, this work that you're doing. So those are, those are kind of that's how we've done it. And I'll talk more a little bit later on kind of what our big takeaways are. And I think I'm going to pass it to Kelly, because she's got some really, really direct and really important work that she's been doing with her philanthropic families.
Thanks, Judy and Ray. I just agree so much with all that you said. And my hope is not to bring necessarily deep expertise, but some nuanced lessons that I have learned and observed in probably the last 6 years of guiding families in democracy strategies. And a lot of it was, you know, coming from values, for my values, and I think many of our growing values in this sector of philanthropy around kind of trust-based practices and thinking about what that really means and how that translates to value and benefit for grassroots groups in particular that are dealing with a lot more than we know, that just from the front and the election outcomes. It's the elections are almost like a symptom of democracy versus like the thing, right? It's not democracy. Elections are an outcome of some of this work. And so I worked with a family, a foundation that when I started with them, I kind of operate as their part-time ED. When I started with them, they were interested. It was in 2018. They wanted to go on a democracy strategy or build one and start to do some funding. And so with not having expertise myself, it was up to me to create the learning journey. And I think as advisors to all these giving families that you support, I don't think you have to have all the expertise. It's kind of who you connect with, who you connect them with that can help. And so we learned, and I learned directly from folks like Miles Rappaport of now what 100% Democracy. He was the former president of Demos, the former president of Common Cause. He served 5 terms in the House of Representatives in Connecticut. Like, this man knows everybody in this field, in this world of democracy. Miles became like my best friend. He's for Boston Foundation folks, he was a senior practice fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. And the foundation funded a little bit of his fellowship. And it allowed us this open dynamic and narrative and back and forth, which turned into a friendship, which turned into introductions to consultants that have deep analysis and expertise, like an Allegra Chapman, who I highly recommend. You can link your donor families either for education opportunities with these kinds of folks or even for guidance. This foundation that I worked for brought in Allegra for a very short period of time to do a general landscape analysis, show the needs of the certain period in that moment in different key states. And then it helped to guide the family on maybe where they might want to sharpen their targeted geographic strategy, how it might complement and intersect with some of the issues they cared about, whether it was environmental or climate justice work, arts and culture work overlaps into all of this. And so learning and then it wasn't like the lesson 2 was kind of like learn as you go. I think a lot of funders think they have to have all of the knowledge, all the expertise, all of the landscape and understanding of where they can fund this versus, okay, do a little bit of learning and then leap in and learn as you go. And one of the greatest lessons here was joining and having this foundation invest in a collaborative fund called the Democracy and Power Innovation Fund. This was something, a collaborative fund, and there are many more out there. There's the Democracy Frontlines Fund that was launched by Crystal Haling at Libra. But the DPI fund came out of the Rockefeller Family Fund. And it is a growing group of funders, but the learning comes from the bottom up. It is not heavy funder driven. And so finding that environment was a game changer. It built more confidence in this family philanthropy's kind of strategies and investments. So they were funding, and then this group was re-granting based on guidance from groups on the ground and organizers on the ground. It brought in an advisory committee that wasn't funder heavy, but it was local folks. It hosts an annual convening every year with unbelievable sessions and webinars. And so like this was a learning environment that complemented the building strategy for this foundation. It complemented and gave the breadth of learning and a confidence in kind of doing some deeper investments in this work. So thinking about a collaborative fund that is really more participatory and more driven from the roots up instead of funder heavy was a great investment that helped a lot. I would say, just like what Judy was saying and Ray, you know, this is not something where I think what I've heard from grassroots groups in this sector, now that I've worked closely with many in Georgia for the last 5 years or 6 years, is that funders come in and fund election cycles, election years, and then they go away. And it's those off election years that are actually some of the most important times for these groups. Think about Georgia. Think about how long Stacey Abrams and those local Black women organizers had to build trust and relational organizing strategies in those communities. And it took a decade or more that then resulted in some outcomes they hoped for more voter inclusion and voter participation and access to the vote for marginalized and more minority or oriented communities. And so funding in off election years is actually almost more important in some ways, or that consistency. The multi-year funding is key. The general operating that Ray talked about was key. So how you fund is really critical. And I found that also the other lesson was that I've been told by these groups is that funders come in like May or June or September to fund their efforts, and it is not helpful. It actually, they are way beyond the needs there to try to integrate those funds in, particularly in an election year. So helping guide funders to do that early on, even out of cycle. Don't wait for the spring board meeting to make some of these decisions. This foundation that I'm guiding is created an urgency of now fund that is one of those flexible funds that they move resources all the time. And so you probably have some more of that flexibility with your kinds of donors. But thinking about early on, unrestricted, off election cycle. And then I wanted to offer some thoughts about going beyond the grant. When we talk about strategies for investing in small grassroots groups that are truly what you think about systems change, you can't do that without truly getting the folks on the ground to build their agency, to build power, to organize and build relations, to inspire the next generation to be civic leaders, civically engaged. It takes the local efforts, and it can be really complemented by national groups that know how to come into these place-based efforts in ways that are not extractive. A lot of these local groups were telling me that these big national groups would fly in, float in an election year, take over a lot of the strategies locally, and actually can sometimes be less helpful in that, and almost block some of the key momentum that some of these local groups have and the proximate knowledge that they have. So thinking about groups like All Voting is Local that go into spaces and really partner with capacity building strategies that provide data that often these small groups don't have, that provide marketing and communication strategies, research of opportunities. Like there are capacity building needs that these national groups can bring in to support grassroots efforts. But the other piece is a lot of these small groups are often BIPOC led, often at least in the spaces I've been working in, Black women led. And if you think about the racial bias in our sector of funding, you've got to, and the lack of access that they have for these types of funding resources, particularly general operating and multi-year, it is another mountain and another hurdle to climb for Black, or BIPOC women, particularly, that are leading these small groups. So how can these donors, how can the community foundations encourage and connect these groups to other funders? How can you think about one of the greatest things that came up is going beyond the grant. So funding is nice, but one of the guidance that I've given recently is that what I'm hearing from these grassroots leaders are that there's huge safety concerns right now for their teams. They have incredible burnout and strain and stress for a whole host of reasons, not just the friction in an election year. There's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of training needs. And so what I guided this foundation to do was, okay, make your grant towards a general operating effort. But then we added on a $15,000 grant that was called a care package grant. And we said to these folks, this care package grant is for you as leaders to decide what you need, what your teams need give these leaders the agency to say, maybe we need a professional development day. Maybe we need a massage therapist to come in weekly to just give my folks a break. Maybe we need to shore up our emergency and safety supports, because there is a great deal of concern around that right now in this year. So thinking about them as humans, added, the response I have gotten from these leaders in these local communities has been overwhelming. And I'm really excited to kind of see what they were able to do with those funds. That we gave the leeway, but they were about taking care of people, taking care of their teams. And so thinking about guiding your folks to go beyond the grant can matter. I guess the last thing I'll share, and I don't have it all, but is thinking about the Cheesecake Factory menu. That was so true. One of the areas that this foundation funds is in kind of civic engagement education with high school students. So thinking about like that can be an angle altogether of civic engagement. How are you creating civic leaders, people that are civically minded, to understand that actually eventually serving on your school board, or serving on your, a municipal board or something to that effect, is actually very, very important. And so thinking about the next generation, thinking about funding research, the DPI fund has some amazing research that it did really from the ground up around Black voter behaviors and values, and they're doing the same kind of approach. And I'll share that as soon as I can get access to it. We can follow up with those resources, but that research has been groundbreaking. I mentioned capacity building. A lot of these groups need help with marketing and communications, translating data into narrative strategies. And then the intersectional strategies that I talked about, thinking about what funders care about. And don't overlook arts and culture in democracy. There's some great work out of the Penn State with a professor by the name of Ray Block, who has seen the power of arts and narrative in building democratic and civic engagement strategies. So sometimes opening up funders' minds to not just like funding the ballet, but like seeing how arts and culture can play a role in building belonging, in advancing narrative, in having and creating spaces for dialogue across difference. I want to double down on arts and culture as an exploration and a creative way to think about supporting democracy. So I will turn it back to you, Daria, and happy to put some other resources out there.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much to all three of you. That's a great start to this conversation. And I would just, welcome any questions that folks have, whether you want to just come off camera, go on camera, sorry, and like raise your hand, or if you have a question that you want to ask in the chat. We really want this to be interactive. So if anyone has, questions for the speakers or something they'd like to learn more about, please let us know.
Or if any of you all have been doing this work and have lessons to share with us, we would more than welcome that.
Absolutely.
Kelly, I just wanted to kind of echo your point about arts and culture. I think that is become such an important part of the work we do. And, I think for donors, they like the idea of being able to fund in kind of the arts space as well. But with this kind of nuanced lens, it's not just, the Denver Symphony or Colorado Ballet. It's some very small organizations that, we have an organization we fund and donors have funded about keeping kind of the school to prison pipeline through arts and using that as a way to engage teenagers so that they're not ending up in the other kind of in prisons, but also learning how to use their voices in civic engagement. So I think and we're just about to launch, not on my side, but on Ray's side of the house, an arts and culture grant cycle, kind of with kind of that bigger picture in mind.
Yeah, Pip, go ahead.
I have a question about, community foundations are so we're place-based right? Many are focused on a city or a county or a local region. I work for a statewide community foundation, which has challenges and opportunities. And I'm curious about, I'm thinking about we have a growth goal, and we have, each state, each city has so many challenges that they're working on, housing obviously being a primary one for many of us. And I'm thinking about the appetite of donors to be either stay place-based with this kind of work or to think more broadly. Because I'm thinking about sort of Oregon as a state, we don't have the resources that many other states have. And like, is there an opportunity for us to attract folks to come in and do this kind of work in Oregon when they don't live here? Like, what's the appetite in your experience for folks to stay localized versus think kind of more broadly or nationally, if you like?
I'm curious to get Kelly's thoughts on that mostly, but I'll share from a policy point of view. Especially, we fund ballot measure campaigns. That's a big part of what we do on our advocacy side of things. And ballot measure campaigns are expensive, and our little community foundation and even all of our peer foundations combined, even if we all care about the same issue, we can't fund a $20 million ballot measure campaign. And so something we've been really exploring over the past few years on the advocacy side of things is trying to build relationships with national funders to ask, what are indicators that you would want to see to come in and invest with the much bigger dollars, the capacity to really bankroll a campaign? If we gave a $60,000 grant for research and the research demonstrated XYZ, then would you be able to come in? And so I think, at least in my experience with that type of work, building relationships with national funders who can say, with whatever discretionary grant dollars you have, or if a few donors pooled their funds to get to a $100,000 investment in this type of community organizing base building or investment in local civic engagement leaders, then we would bankroll $1 million voter participation program or something to that nature. Kelly, I'm curious what your perspective is from the national level.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ray. Not Pip, one of the things I saw from this very small foundation that I've guided, that was pretty traditionally place-based in New England, is because of the research and the learning that they did with Allegra, that kind of opened up what was a landscape analysis of the state of democracy in our country during this time. What were some pivotal states in that moment that were grappling with some key issues or had some real impacts on that were fighting maybe more increased voter suppression issues, having more challenges than some areas of the country. That became a way that they informed, and they went outside of their place-based strategy, and decided to double down and go deep for years now, consistently in the state of Georgia. There's no family roots there. There's no connection there, but it has felt strategic and it has felt impactful to support grassroots groups, because after certain elections, the voter suppression tactics, like in the South in particular, has skyrocketed. So the South is a landscape that I think we've learned that it has a lot of great need around this. In terms of like place-based and local investments where there might not be a heated environment or that kind of climate, I think about that being a wonderful setup for next gen development in civic engagement, arts and culture roles that of narrative and things like that. But thinking about civic engagement and active roles with colleges, partnering with colleges to support maybe democracy or civic programs there, research, those types of things can be useful. And then I think the collaborative fund that I mentioned, that's another way where a local place-based funder might feel more comfortable to expand its geographic reach in a strategic way, because now you're pooling resources that are now going into key targeted states and regions and communities that have some outsized impact just by the pooled resources. And so those are some ways that I've thought about it without having like on the ground expertise, for decades, but that's what I've seen be useful.
Well, and Kelly, we just had an example, and Pip really, of a donor family who decided that one of their priorities was going to be around kind of donor engagement, civic engagement, and voter participation as their strategy, as their funding this year. And it was a, grandmother and grandchildren. And so they picked a state that they felt was just in their minds. It was not Colorado. They're local funders, but they picked a state. They picked Arizona because they felt, and I apologize if anyone on the phone is on the call is from Arizona, but felt like this is where they need to be. And they researched really all on their own. We did not guide them. They really researched and found. And I think it was, to your point, Kelly, about next gen involvement. It was a great way to get these kind of adult, 20-something grandchildren to really go out and find some organizations that they cared that were doing voter work, and made some grants out of there. So it was apparently a very good conversation between the grandmother and the grandchildren. And it was a great way to, for them to feel that they were participating in a different way.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Are there any other questions that folks have, or things that you're doing that you'd like to share with the group? We'd love to hear about that too.
I'll just quickly say this is super helpful, coming from the Boston Foundation, where we have a lot of folks who we support their donor advised funds, and they're often already supporting a lot of local organizations, but in kind of presidential years, right, they tend to think about wanting to expand their impact nationally. And Kelly, I really appreciate your comments about reminding folks that it needs to be, way above and beyond just in the presidential election cycle, to be thinking about these issues. So I appreciate hearing that. So I don't really have a question or too much more to add. I just will say, I think the pooled funds that you mentioned, and some of the others, like from Tides, and some other sort of more nationally based pooled funds, I think have resonated with some of the folks that I've worked with. I think specifically because of the feeling that their impact is multiplied by working in conjunction with fellow donors. So I appreciate, though, Kelly, you kind of adding a few. I didn't know one of the organizations that you shared, and so I appreciate hearing that, because I'm going to add that to my list. So thank you for that.
No, you're most welcome. And I think that the need for collaboration, the need for learning, is just, we're never going to get anywhere on all of our issues that we care about without that. And so you see a real growing trend in that way, and in a more healthy way I've seen lately. I think in the 20 some years I've observed in this sector, a lot of collaborative funds can be very top heavy and can do a little bit more of directing and prescribing than actually listening and strategizing with the right people, with the right voices. I'm curious if community foundations have ever created their own pooled funds with donors, with your donor base that could come, would that have mutual interests, where that you might organize the donors that you have in an opportunity to pool funds towards a certain issue. Is that something that's you do? Okay, Pip, that's great. Yeah, I'm not an expert at community foundations, but I think that's really key. And this could be an area that could be useful in that way for some shared learning and impact.
And Julian, I saw you had, not to put you on the spot, but I saw you had come off mute. Did you have a question or something you wanted to share?
Not necessarily. The Boston Community Foundation kind of hit on what we were thinking. There's, just so you know, for attendance purposes, we're in a room of 4 people feverishly taking notes and very much appreciating everything you're sharing. But
Yeah.
I think we struggle. So we're in Indiana, and very much a red state, but we're in a blue city. And so sometimes I've heard donors just all across the board, some that say, I am so done with bipartisan playing happy in the middle, absolutely not, no more, I'm going full hog. And then others where we don't know how to enter that conversation because we don't want to make the wrong assumptions. And so we do, like Ray said, like there's that kind of safe, happy middle civic engagement. And I find that with the donors that do talk to me or to our teammates about it, it's they know their vision and their political, you know, thought process and frustrations more than we do. And so it's not our job to necessarily, it's just our job to help them know what's out there. So I appreciated you sharing something like DPI because I also appreciate what you said, Kelly, that it's the long game. But in an election year, sometimes it doesn't seem like the long game. So do I sink my money and efforts in Arizona where it might matter because Indiana seems like a lost cause unless I'm talking blue city and I'm talking local. So I really like the DPI fund and things like that, that they are bigger, they are national, but they have local impact in grassroots movements and collaborators and all the things. So so I appreciate that. We also have, and I don't know a good way to share it because it's literally a picture that we took of a resource that was shared in hard copy, but it's this list of democracy intermediaries and networks. It's this huge list. So I'll find a way, we'll share it with you, but it's literally like a picture and you can like see my hand holding it. So it's really classy and high tech, but it lists like who's a C3 and who's a C4 for those of us that are trying to figure out, well, when you're coming from your donor advised fund, you can't do the C4s. And so what can you support? And it's everything from, there's groups that are by race, groups that are for children and advocacy and all the things, and really list that out. So we'll find a way to share that in case you're sharing other resources.
Yes,
And I
that would
think-
be wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. That would be fantastic. And we'll figure out how to pretty it up if we need to. But thank you so
you're going
much.
to need to.
Okay. I'm sorry, Judy, you were going
Oh,
to say.
no, I think that Julian and Indiana folks, I think to your point, like it is also about messaging. I think that a lot of times, we really do try to talk about kind of the nonpartisan nature of the work we're doing. Now, obviously, some would say there are some partisan issues if we're getting involved in reproductive justice questions, although we could argue otherwise very clearly. But I think that we have, just as a cautionary tale, there have been, I can think of one or two potential donors who said to me, your work at Rose Community Foundation is too partisan. And I don't want to be connected with that. And it doesn't matter how you phrase it when you show all of the things that we've done that aren't nonpartisan. If somebody has that in their mind, you're probably not going to change that person's mind. So it can be discouraging, but also recognize it. Okay, go back to the values alignment, and maybe this person was not so values aligned. Again, we have the privilege of being able to say that, but it is a lot about both values alignment and around messaging and really being clear in kind of how we're presenting this work.
And the one thing I'd add, as I always try to make the case at Rose for the policy work, and sometimes our donor services folks get a little scared of what I have to say, but we have also seen being super clear and out front about our values and how they relate to our policy and advocacy work attract new folks to us. And so folks like donor advised fund holders that we were barely on their radar before we took a stand on certain issue. We're super deep on immigration work. As Judy's alluded to, we're pretty deep on abortion, issues like gun violence prevention that not a lot of our peers are necessarily comfortable taking policy stands around, or a lot of our private foundation peers legally can't take policy stands around. And as a result, Judy, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about the Kentucky Reproductive Freedom Fund, but we've literally had out-of-state funds that we had no relationship with call us to say, hey, we saw your policy work and we'd like to open a fund with you because of that values alignment.
Yeah, and I mean, it's become one of our most active funds, and it has become a fund because of Kentucky's restrictions on abortion. And at the time it was opened, I think now it's been about 2 years ago, there was some real fear as to what was going to happen there. The kind of founders of the fund researched around, saw what we have said very publicly in terms of our stance on reproductive rights, and came to us. We now have regular donors to that fund besides the funders. We'll get, coming from kind of all over the country, and the fund was designed to support initiatives in Kentucky, but also does some national funding. So yeah, Ray, when you started talking, I was thinking the same thing. The Kentucky Reproductive Fund has really been important to us, and really because we were very clear who we were.
Well, this has been great. I really appreciate you all. I know that's a silly expression, small but mighty, but it really is. And that, there's several, a good number of community foundations on this call, and you're all doing amazing work. And just from the conversation, I know it's thanks so much. I know that it's not easy work at all. So just want to thank you all for everything that you do every day, and for the conversation. Want to thank Judy, Ray, and Kelly for sharing their experiences and their expertise, what's worked, what's not, their challenges, and for all of you for being here with us today, because I know time is our most precious commodity, and the fact that you spent an hour with us means a lot, so I appreciate it. And this can just be the beginning of a conversation. Happy to connect you to the speakers and or each other, if you want to continue the conversation. Just want to let you know we have several upcoming Community Foundation Network programs. A virtual program in June about telling the story of your community foundations, philanthropic services, how they've evolved. We know a lot of community foundations have evolved them over the several years, and wanting to share stories from several community foundations about what that looks like, and to learn from you all. Also, we're going to have our in-person Community Foundations Family Philanthropy Network workshop on September 17th in Atlanta. The day before the national forum starts. And so we'd love your ideas, whether through the survey or just emailing me directly, or any one of my colleagues, about what you'd like to see discussed at that workshop. It's really focused on learning from each other, and also having discussions about what's going on in the field. Our national forum, as I mentioned, is taking place in Atlanta from September 18th to 20th. And early bird is for one more week, early bird registration, and then regular registration opens. We'd love for you to be part of our conversations about bold choices, bold change. We have a really exciting agenda that we're putting together, and more information of the agenda will be out soon, but we hope that you will join us. We sold out in 2022, and so we know there's a lot of interest, and hope you will join the conversation. And then just let you know about our monthly fundamentals webinars, which I know you all know about. Our one in June is about clarifying your purpose and legacy. It's part one of a several-part series about our family giving life cycle. I hope you will consider coming to that. It's always a really interesting conversation. And then, we have several peer networks for your family donors. If they're interested in learning more about those, again, happy to answer any of your questions, and give additional information to you or to your donors about how to join several of our peer networks. And again, just want to thank you all for being with us today. Thank you to our speakers. If you're able to fill out the survey, we really do listen to them. That'd be super helpful. And again, thank you to Judy, Ray, and Kelly for sharing your time and expertise with us, and to all of you for being here. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, and hope you're all well and safe, and look forward to seeing you at an upcoming